All right. So we are good. Thank you very much for your patience. We apologize for the technical difficulties, but I guess that's just the Pacific way, right? One of the challenges. I'm going to hand it over to our moderator, but just to let everyone know, especially for those watching online, that the camera may go. We'll still have audio available. And so let's go ahead and proceed with our first panel. And I will pass it on to our moderator, Ms. Kino Kabua. Thank you very much.
Good morning, KD, and Yagwen, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second and final day of our Pacific Women Leaders Coalition Conference. We are going to continue this morning with session 2 on an important and exciting theme that I believe all of us are interested in, and that is women in leadership. We have a great panel with us this morning, and I'd like to acknowledge the presence of 3 of them. Honorable Congresswoman Aumua Amata Coleman Radwagon of American Samoa, Honorable Judith Juan Pat, former Speaker of Guam's legislature, and Director Ms. Leituala Queenie Salani Tago El Yusara of the Pacific Community. Ladies, thank you very much for joining us. Later on, we will also be hearing 3 pre-recorded messages from Secretary General Dame Meg Taylor of the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, Ms. Linda Peterson, consultant and self-employed in Fiji, and last but certainly not the least, our very own Ambassador Doreen de Broom, who is based in Geneva. A critical concern that we are all aware of is that the Pacific region has the lowest percentage of women in parliaments than any other region in the world. We know that women are powerful agents of change, and there is an ever-increasing body of evidence and recognition of the far-reaching benefits of diversity and gender parity in leadership and decision-making that is increasingly recognized in all spheres. Research shows that when women are meaningfully represented and engaged in leadership bodies, such as legislatures, courts, executive boards, community councils, and so on, laws, rulings, and decisions are more likely to be inclusive, representative, and to take diverse views into account. The case for balancing the power equation in leadership has never been clearer. Elevating women in decision-making benefits politics, businesses, and communities. But we all know that progress in women's leadership will not happen automatically. And despite a number of initiatives in the region for a number of election cycles, men make up the majority of leaders. Our first panel this morning will discuss actions we can take together across governments, corporations, academia, nonprofits, and civil society to balance power in leadership and decision-making. Before I ask our first panel member a question, a friendly reminder to our online audience to submit your questions or comments for the panel members right after each panelist has spoken. If I may now proceed to our first panel member, Congresswoman Radwagon. You are a member of several House committees, including Small Business, Natural Resources, and Veterans Affairs. Can you share your experience balancing the power in these committees and how you promote gender equality and women's human rights?
Thank you very much for this opportunity to be here today. As you know, we are early in the 116th Congress, and it is the most diverse in our history, including the most ever women elected to Congress, totaling about 1/4 of the entire membership of Congress. Now, back in American Samoa, women can hold chiefly titles, but for us, elected leadership for women has not had such, it hasn't really taken hold yet. For myself, I ran for Congress 10 times and lost 10 times in a row. That's 22 years of my life. And but the thing is that opportunity is kind of a natural result of the kind of system that we have in the United States, free and open system. And as I mentioned yesterday, that is why Taiwan has strong female participation in their legislatures and in their local offices. Getting back to what I do in Congress, I was very warmly welcomed back in 2014 when I was first elected. And there were 9 candidates, and when the dust cleared, God had been very helpful. So when I came up to Congress, immediately I became chairman of a small business subcommittee, a key one for American Samoa. And not all of the members have 3 committees, but I was put on 3 committees. The Natural Resources, which deals with the U.S. territories, the freely associated states, all of Micronesia. We also have responsibility for 567 federally recognized Indian tribes, and so it's a wide array of responsibilities and duties we have there. I'm also on the Veterans Affairs Committee, which 10% of our entire population in American Samoa is military veterans, and 10% of the population is active military. And so these 3 committees, almost 100% of the businesses in American Samoa are small businesses. So these were very, very relevant to us. In terms of the U.S. Congress, I do not, the women are coming along. And as I mentioned, the numbers have really shot up. And that's really a good thing. And it can only get better. I would say that I'm delighted to be in Congress. If you want to get a little more specific, I'd be glad to add on to it.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Former Speaker Pat, brain drain continues to be a challenge in the islands. What are your views on how to stop the brain drain of Pacific Island countries' educated and skilled workers?
Thank you very much for the question, and Look Wei, and good morning. Guam has actually gone through a brain drain in the 60s, early 60s, because right after the war, many of our people had actually left the island because they were able to get permission to leave the island in the 50s. So in the 60s, then they were moving off island for better quality of life and primarily for education and job opportunities. My family also participated in that move as well, to go off island to go to school. I came back. I was hired, actually recruited by the Department of Education to teach at home. But I think one of the most important things about what to do in terms of, you won't be able to stop it, but you definitely can slow it down. And I really believe that it starts at the home, because I saw what had happened in my own family. And what I did when I got married and decided to have a family was to basically instill in my children the love of our culture, the love of our island, our people. And that, yes, we know that we need to probably go off island, get an education, but to return home and give back to the island. That was definitely instilled in me by my parents, who were both educators, and my father ultimately went to Congress as a delegate for Guam. But as an educator, that was something that I've always instilled, not just in my children, but the school children where I was the school principal. I also feel that what's important, because taking the example given to me, is that when they recruited me, the government not only paid for my transportation my household effects. And when I arrived on island, I was guaranteed a job, and I was also provided housing. The salary was comparable to everyone's salary. So all that were positive aspects of bringing back those professionals, educated individuals, to bring them home. So it's really important that the government does a marketing campaign, like for example, what we're doing right now with the University of Guam. We're telling all of our school children, because we want them to go to our university, that when you get out of high school, that the University of Guam will be the natural choice. So, because many times our children want to go off island, go to the mainland to get an education, but we have a university that's definitely accredited and can compete with any other university in the United States. So that's a campaign, marketing campaign that we're using. The other thing is that we need to, of course, show our young people that we will be able to mentor them. We would also try to make sure that there is really a merit system of hiring individuals, and that is not based on nepotism or those that you know and not necessarily who you know. And that, we provide, of course, comparable salaries through these students or young workers to the community. So what we did, my other life as a senator, is that we saw a brain drain in education and in the medical profession. So the government then, we provided funding to be able to give every student who would like to get an education and go into the field of education, is that we would pay for their tuition and books, we would give them a stipend, and we would guarantee them a job when they get out. So that's what we did for our teachers. For those in the medical profession, is that we provided scholarships, because this is a lot more expensive. But similar to the teachers, though, is that we would pay for their tuition, and but they must all come back and serve. So for every year that we pay for your tuition, free tuition, it's 1 year of service to the government, but you don't have to pay back in dollars. It's just service. And hopefully by then you would, have that love and compassion to want to give back to your community and decide to stay.
Thank you. I'd like to come back to the mentoring part later if there's time in the Q&A session. Thank you. Director Queenie Salani, drawing on your years of experience as a senior executive in the public sector, what do you think are the contributing factors to the glass ceiling, and how is it changing?
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Good morning, and Iyakwe. There are several contributing factors, and these can be explored at different levels and can be looked at from different perspectives. If we begin with ourselves as women, our mindsets and attitudes, and the mindsets and attitudes of our society and our communities and those around us, usually informed by our traditional views of leadership, has meant that we have had set definitions of leadership, and that these traditional definitions of leadership often do not include women as leaders. Now, related to that is the whole question around capacity and capabilities. And while we may have the aspirations to achieve more in the leadership space, sometimes we often lack the capacity and capabilities that is required to advance our goals in breaking the glass ceiling. The second factor relates to our environments or the systems that we are a part of, and how our environments or systems could either be ones that are a lot more progressive and therefore nurtures and promotes opportunities for both men and women, or it could be those that continue to suppress opportunities for women and do not promote a culture of learning that invests in building women's capacity, nurturing their potential, including how women's agency can help us achieve better development results. The last factor that I wish to speak to is one of commitment and leadership and political will. Clearly, without the commitment of our leaders in any given context or in any environment, we cannot make progress on advancing opportunities for women in leadership. Strong commitment and political will shall enable an environment that is conducive to promoting opportunities for women, sustained investments, and a dedicated focus on building capacity and the necessary capabilities that not only advance opportunities for our women, but will also help us achieve our sustainable development goals. Now, in terms of how these factors or dimensions are changing, there is definitely a lot more awareness of gender equality today than we did in the last 2 to 3 decades. And additionally, a lot more awareness of the challenges around gender equality. For example, the generation of knowledge and evidence on violence against women has directly resulted in some shifts at policy level, and that we now have laws and legislations to address the issue. Although much more needs to be done in terms of services for survivors of violence. Attitudes towards women's leadership is also changing. For example, the constitutional reform to increase the representation of women in parliament in Samoa is a major shift in a national context where politics has always been perceived as a male-dominant space. Numbers of women taking on professional careers in male-dominated fields, such as in maritime, fisheries, and infrastructure, for example, are some of the changes that we continue to see and witness, demonstrating a shift in attitudes and an increasing appreciation of women learning diverse skills outside of what is traditionally considered as women's areas of work. And so, Madam Moderator, these dimensions are changing, and while progress is slow, I'd like to think that we are heading in the right direction, moving forward, and the tide is turning for the better in terms of gender equality in our region.
Thank you, Queenie. And I would like to also come back to you with a question on the constitutional reform in Samoa that increased the representation of women in your parliament. We have now reached the pre-recorded video session. If I can ask the team to put them on. We'll be hearing first from the Secretary General of the Forum Secretariat, followed by Linda Peterson, and then Ambassador Doreen DeBroom. After that, we'll go into the Q&A session, where we hopefully will have a lot of questions from the audience as well as our online viewers.
I think why women's leadership is so very important for the Blue Pacific continent is this, that we are very much a part of the Pacific family. We play different roles to our male partners, our brothers, our husbands, the political leadership that is dominated by men, and that is just fact, it's not an assertion. Well, I never really sat down and worked it all out. I've been very fortunate that opportunities have been given to me, and I think I came from a family that was very strong about concern for others and giving me an opportunity to really prepare myself in terms of my own education. I was also educated by a group of Catholic sisters, nuns, who were very committed to the education of women and also to women having a voice, women have to be articulate. So all those things in my childhood and in my years of high school prepared me for challenges that were given to me by my community, but also time, it will become easier, and young women will have an opportunity as they... My own role, I never really sat down and worked it all out. I've been very fortunate that opportunities have been given to me, and I think I came from a family that was very strong about concern for others and giving me an opportunity to really prepare myself in terms of my own education. I was also educated by a group of Catholic sisters, nuns, who were very committed to the education of women and also to women having a voice, women have to be articulate. So all those things in my childhood and in my years of high school prepared me for challenges that were given to me by my community, but also by my government to serve as in senior positions. And now I'm here in this position as Secretary General of the Pacific Island Forum, a responsibility that I take very seriously, that my life and what I do and achieve can
Her Excellency President Dr. Hilda Heine, elected representatives, government officials, ambassadors and representatives of regional organizations. Thank you for this opportunity and congratulations, President Heine, on convening this inaugural Pacific Women Leaders Coalition Conference. I'm honored and excited to be addressing this eminent group of women leaders and actually quite nervous, so please excuse me if I start and repeat myself along the way. Do I see value in a Pacific Women Leaders Coalition? I most certainly do, and I think it's long overdue. Why is this? Well, for too long, I think our region has been hindered by development policies that undermine sustainable development and contribute to increasingly levels of inequality by not taking gender seriously. And I honestly believe that a coalition of the like-minded with a common goal and focus established at the highest levels of decision-making can change this. I can't remember the last time I read the agenda or the outcomes of a regional meeting on climate change, on health, education, finance, or trade, labor and employment, economic security, or even defense that included gender on the agenda and in its action outcomes in a substantive way and held the decision makers at these meetings to account. I'm not sure, but I think most, if not all, of the submissions to the regional subcommittee that decides on what should be addressed by Pacific Island Forum leaders through the framework for Pacific regionalism are gender blind. Sadly, this is where we are, despite high levels of overseas development assistance to the region and decades of work by women-led civil society groups, gender machineries, and many others. This really has to change. Continuing to ignore and not address gender equality as a critical development issue will mean that we won't achieve the sustainable development goals as a region, and we won't fully achieve the vision set out in the regional framework in the framework for Pacific regionalism and its related country and future priority projects. Addressing gender equality requires understanding, accepting, and prioritizing, giving the highest priority to gender equality as a critical development issue. It needs leadership by governments and by regional organizations to promote, to implement, and to resource gender equality measures in all aspects of their work. And being accountable to the people, to parliaments, and to the region through well-informed and inclusive regional dialogue and processes. And at a very basic level, this means exposure to real situations of gender inequality based on women's reality and their lives at all in different areas, drawn from national and community level experiences, and understanding this through sharing stories, through experiences, through research, discussion, analysis, and debate, and bringing this kind of real lived experience and knowledge into both national, but most importantly, regional policy fora. In our region, there are women and men who can provide this kind of commentary, this kind of information, this kind of knowledge and experience, and they can provide it in an independent and a non-political way, led from their Pacific experience. And they can advise on ways to address gender inequality. We need to use this experience and this expertise. If our leaders and elected representatives across the board can't see the value and importance of doing this, then maybe a Pacific Women Leaders Coalition can and will push and affect this agenda. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the outcomes of your discussions. Vinaka.
Yahweh Komale, my name is Faith Larkin, and I am the Executive Director for the Marshallese Educational Initiative. We are a nonprofit based in Springdale, Arkansas.
Yahweh aday kanit yung matarbalo MEI and Ojon program special.
Here at MEI, our mission is to promote Marshallese culture.
Yung merigin jadian mino kami ang ikamani. And these are the stuff that we do.
One of the first projects that MEI did was collect oral histories from elders here in Northwest Arkansas. With the growing number of Marshallese children being born and raised in the United States, we felt it was really important to collect these stories so that we could teach our children about Manit.
Imjon yan mino kami ang ikamani e charwalipin lilabaro aga karero lo Springdale, Arkansas nganamim kazen ngi rujuguro imajuriro ilo Springdale.
We feel it's really important to promote Marshallese arts. Education is central to what MEI does. Some of what we've done have included mentorship programs in middle schools. We've also have done supply drives for students. Our goal for the Marshallese Youth Academy is for these students to appreciate traditional Marshallese arts and culture, to build leadership skills, and for them to engage in and value community service. One of our main objectives is to make sure that Marshallese students are successful in high school and on to higher education. It's always been very important to MEI to educate about the nuclear legacy. MEI hosted Nuclear Remembrance Day in 2014 at the Clinton Library in Little Rock, Arkansas. My mom is from Rolla Atoll. She is a nuclear survivor. She spoke at the Clinton Library in 2014. This was the first time she had ever told her story, and it was empowering for her.
How things continue to impact people over decades and centuries, long after the bomb itself has been forgotten. But not in my country. We have not forgotten.
This is Ms. Tina Stich of Marshallese Education Initiative.
The people of the Marshall Islands know what it truly means to live in a world with nuclear weapons. In our families and our communities, we continue to grapple with the pain and despair wrought by the effects of nuclear weapons testing on our bodies and on our lands. It is because of this knowledge that we refuse to give up hope for a nuclear weapons-free world. Como dada, thank you.
In our classes and cultural trainings, we talk about our nuclear legacy and about Marshallese history.
In the islands, and so all that. Likatu? Likatu. Lakatu. So you cannot say to a girl that you're Lakatu.
Over the past few months, MEI has been working with several organizations in the area to raise awareness about domestic violence.
MEI brought Selena Leem to Springdale to share her experiences and to encourage other women to speak out.
Imjonian no kami ang ikonono kagi ilo imiay e ngan karong Olive Carrero ilo Springdale igitien domestic violence.
As an organization made up of women, it is empowering for us to be able to serve our community. We are empowered by what we do.
Okay, well, I hope these videos have sparked some questions in your minds as we now go into the Q&A session. I was told there's no questions from our online audience, so if I can ask our audience here that are present with us, do we have any questions for the panel members? Ambassador.
Good morning. Karen Stewart, the American ambassador to the Marshall Islands. Because the U.S. government does support some leadership development programs, there's one here that we've been doing in cooperation with New Zealand and with the East-West Center, and globally we have just created an academy for women's leadership. So I would be interested in the panel's views in terms of, is that useful? Can you teach leadership? And if so, what should you teach? What skills or what developments would you be looking for? Thank you.
Great question, Ambassador. Thank you. And if I can ask our panelists to maybe quickly give 2 or 3 points in your answers. Can I ask Congresswoman to go first? Thank you.
It's a very interesting question. In my own case, I come from a family with a kind of a legacy of public service. And while I did not start out as a child thinking, yes, I'm going to run for Congress one day, I was always around my father, who not only served as governor of American Samoa for 4 terms, but he also worked out here during the UN Trust Territory. So I was able to follow his example and watch everything that he did. And I think that while you can't really teach leadership per se, I guess you could by your own examples. We were always, as we grew up, just even as small children, we always seemed to be in the public eye wherever our family lived, all over Micronesia and the rest of the Pacific. So we were just sort of expected to perhaps behave a little better than the other children, things like that. But I think that women are, they're still kind of a work in progress, and there's so much discipline there, and you really, women still are at the point where they have to jump 3 times higher than the man to prove that they're actually able to jump at all, so to speak. And it takes, I think that the 22 years that I spent going back at it, to the ridicule of my community and even my friends, they thought I was crazy. Well, Now, of course, they think I'm a genius. But I would say that it's up to the woman herself. It begins with her, yes, education and all that works, but it's up to the woman herself to determine if she wants to take this difficult road. And because in American Samoa, and both Samoas probably, there is a saying, Oleala i le pule o le tautua. The road to leadership is paved with service. And for us in American Samoa, you serve your village, your church, and your community. And that is how the leadership, you are evaluated as a leader. And also, being nice counts a lot.
Thank you, Congresswoman. We have, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you for this opportunity. As an educator, of course, and when I eventually went into the legislature, there are two bills that I'd introduced that I really think is very critical for young people, young men and young women, and that's exactly what the Congresswoman mentioned, is service learning, because that develops leadership skills. When they go out to the community, they learn a wide range of experiences, giving back to the community. Character education is the second thing, because that's so important in becoming good, moral, responsible individuals. And what happens is that in return, they would end up learning these core ethical values such as respect, justice, and civil virtues. Specific examples, though, I think that would be really good for, it doesn't matter where, but you need to make the adjustment according to your place, is to allow for civic engagement and participation in the decision-making of our youth, who would, where the parliament would have to create a youth parliament, where these children will go in once a month and play the role and start learning how then their parliament is run. The second is to allow for youth caucuses in their parliament, and also have a youth leadership day. They can be a president for the day, the speaker for a day, a minister for a day, and what have you, and they learn that process. Schools should allow students to set up and organize themselves to plan their activities. Maybe the president might want to appoint a youth representative, maybe to sit on a school board, because they're making a lot of decisions about them. The youth can set up a youth-to-youth mentorship program that they can have a discussion on the issues that affect them, such as drug, mental health issues, social and relationship issues, and more. And lastly, I think that there should be, we should bring in our private and our public sectors to encourage our youth in terms of internship, apprenticeship, and maybe a volunteering scheme as a means of acquiring these skills.
Thank you, former Speaker. Very good suggestions. I want to direct the next question to Director Queenie Salani, going back to how Samoa has implemented constitutional reform to increase the representation of women in Parliament. And other Pacific Island countries have tried unsuccessfully to implement temporary special measures. Why are temporary special measures, in your view, so critical to increasing the proportion of women in Parliament?
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I think temporary special measures are critical because it's the only way to get our governments to do something about this issue, or it's the only way to get all of us to think seriously about it and do something about it. The case of the constitutional reform in Samoa is a classic example, and it wasn't until the amendment and the conversation around the amendment started towards passing the amendments that people then really sort of seriously took the issue on board. And if you look at the results of the last election, that was really telling. And without the application of the constitutional amendments, we wouldn't have the numbers that we now have in Parliament. And so it's a step in the right direction. It's a way to reflect leadership and commitment. And it's a way to put in place measures to guide what we're doing and to get us to where we want to go. The formula in terms of how the amendment is applied could be improved in my view, but I think it's a great start in the right direction, and it's an example that our other Pacific countries and territories can learn from.
Thank you. Sure, go ahead, Congressman.
Because several years ago, I was very humbled to be invited over to independent Samoa to work and visit with these women who wanted to run for parliament. I think there were 24 of them. And it was also a learning experience for me, because the way we run for the U.S. Congress, for instance, there are no special categories. And that perhaps could be one of the reasons why women elected leadership hasn't taken a real strong hold in our particular islands. You go right up against the guys, and there are no special categories to increase participation of this group or that group. That's just the way the U.S. does it. And so there's a tremendous respect for these people who finally make it through this elected process and are chosen by the people. But so in Samoa, it was really very interesting. So many of them were Matai, and I think that there were 5 who ended up getting elected, so we were all very happy about that. But then, on the other hand, perhaps there comes a point in time where the only way you can almost try to balance it out is to have a special categories or seats for a particular part of the community. It's just that that's not the way we do it when we run for the United States Congress.
All right, and we have not a question, but a comment from one of the panel members, our minister from Palau.
Thank you. I'm just going to be less than 1 minute because I know she has like 5 minutes left. I just want to bring into the forefront, to the fore, about because we saw them yesterday. They were sitting over there, and they were the women chiefs. I have not heard in this forum yet. We talk about culture and economics, culture and politics. We need to also bring to the fold the traditional women leaders. Traditionally, they had the titles. And so if we just kind of, how can we merge that, the traditional system of leadership and modern day leadership? And that, I just want to bring that for discussion, and I hope that's going to be brought up further, because it's very important, because we talk about leaders, women leaders, and we haven't brought up the traditional leaders, women leaders. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. I think you also raised a very good issue, and something that personally I see lingering in the questions of, in the minds of some of our younger generation females. Unfortunately, we are limited to 1 hour, and I have 4 minutes left until we need to continue to session 3. So I want to regretfully close this session, but again, thank all the panel members today for your encouraging and insightful advice in the area of women and leadership. I really do wish this was a longer discussion, because I think it sparked up a lot of really good questions and comments from around the table and in the audience. From listening to the comments and views since yesterday to this morning, and talking in the hallway with some of the panelists and other female leaders, I have a few key takeaways and reflections that I'd like to share. One, female leadership matters. It's more important in today's world, and it's important because it gives us results. 2, authenticity. You know, being your true self is core when you want to be a good and effective leader. 3, change starts with each of us. We are all leaders, and whether it's in our families, our communities, in the regional organizations, in the public or private sector, we are all role models for the next generations. 4, if we want to see more females in leadership positions, We need to create more opportunities, including providing mentoring opportunities and modeling and continuing to model what effective leadership looks like. And I think the establishment of a Pacific Women Leaders Coalition can provide a mechanism to model what effective leadership is and to allow for our Pacific women leaders to share their stories. If I can end with a favorite leadership quote from the COO of Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg, quote, "Leadership is about making others better as a result of your presence and making sure that impact lasts in your absence." Thank you again, everyone. And this concludes session 2.
Thank you very much. We will now get ready for our second panel discussion on the topic of gender and human rights, moderated by Ms. Ria Moss Christian, the RMI National Nuclear Commission. Just a reminder that we are live streaming on Facebook and our YouTube channel. And as questions flow in during the panel discussions, we do apologize that there may be some questions unanswered. However, we will pass these on to our media team who are doing interviews with our panelists and moderators who can pose these questions to them, and we will post these up as soon as possible. Thank you very much for tuning in online, and we appreciate your participation.
Yagoy him kaude jole rorian kaude. Laptata iro jumli ro joro ari lo manet. To the ro ari lo kienem kabum. Kabalo bro rane jalo video. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to first of all pay my respect to our traditional leaders, members of the parliament and clergy, and each and every one of you present today. I'm Doreen de Broom, Ambassador of the Republic of the Marshall Islands at the newly established mission in Geneva. The Marshall Islands are a leading example for female leadership in the Pacific. President Hilda Heine, who convened this virtual summit, was the first woman president among Pacific Small Island states. And I'm also proud to say that as of this year, the Republic of the Marshall Islands has as many women ambassadors and general counsels as men. In Marshallese culture, women are referred to as Tiner Kibir. This literally means that a mother, Tiner, is the rudder, Kibir, of a family. Thus, her well-being directly impacts family dynamics, much like the rudder of a canoe. If a rudder becomes compromised or broken, the canoe will become pelak, or drifting without direction. While tradition recognizes the great role of women within the household, in our society, women are actually facing many challenges that prevent them from enjoying full equality. This becomes evident, for instance, in case of natural disasters, to which our country is very vulnerable. Think of periods of drought, during which it is generally young women and children who have to walk long distances to collect water at wells and filling stations. Conscious of these and of many other challenges that women face daily, in terms of access to employment, safety, education, and health, the Marshallese government has taken important steps. In 2015, we adopted the National Gender Mainstreaming Policy, which has guided the government in mainstreaming gender perspectives across its policies, strategies, and programs. One example of our effort is Marshall Islands 2015 Climate Strategy, which was adopted in 2018 and outlines the main action priorities in terms of emissions reductions and adaptation to climate change. This document has a section devoted to gender and human rights, calling upon the government to take a number of actions, for instance, elaborating gender responsive adaptation actions and investments, as well as systematically integrating the differentiated aspects or impacts of climate change into all climate change policy planning and implementation. In order to implement effective policies and strategies, however, we will need further data to understand the extent to which climate change effects are differentiated between men and women, both in the context of slow onset processes such as sea level rise and in the context of sudden onset events such as king tides. As the permanent representative to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva, I will do my best to promote women's rights in the international agenda and make sure that the voices of the most vulnerable are heard at the highest levels. In this, I, along with my colleagues, will be guided by the famous feminist foreign policy theory that is based on the 3 R's, that all women and girls should have access to rights, representation, and resources. Como dada.
Newly appointed ambassador to the RMI mission in Geneva, Ms. Doreen de Broom. We will be commencing our next panel discussion in a few minutes. Um, we are currently preparing all our panelists who will be joining us via Zoom. And so this is give us maybe just a few more minutes and we will continue with our panel. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everyone. We're going to start our panel session on the topic of gender and human rights, moderated by Ms. Ria Moss Christian.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Katie. Okay, that was a an echo of myself.
Okay, we try again.
Okay, we try again.
Great.
Great. I am moderating the third panel on gender and human rights. Although I'm sitting here by myself, our panel members are not sitting far away. Two of them are sitting upstairs, and they're on screen there with Zoom. On this topic for gender and human rights, the UN Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, has stated that achieving gender equality and empowering women and girls is the unfinished business of our time and the greatest human rights challenge in our world. Gender equality is at the very heart of human rights and United Nations values. And as the saying goes, women's rights are human rights. These rights include the right to live free from violence, repression, and discrimination, to be educated, to access health services, to participate in political life, to own property, to vote, and to earn a fair and equal wage. A fundamental principle of the United Nations Charter adopted by world leaders in 1945 is equal rights of men and women, and protecting and promoting women's human rights is the responsibility of all states. The 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda sets ambitious goals for a peaceful and prosperous world and to address the pervasive problems of poverty, violence, and inequality. We need transformative shifts in our societies, and it is widely acknowledged that addressing human rights and gender equality is a necessity for this to happen. We will now hear from our panel members about how we could overcome persistent, harmful sociocultural norms, stigma, misconceptions, and taboos around gender equality and women's human rights that continue to lead to exclusion and discrimination of women and girls. We have a combination of panelists who are meeting with us live online and some recorded videos that we will play after we hear from our panelists who are with us today. And for our online audience who have any questions or comments for the panel, please submit them now, and we will come to those at the end of the live discussion. So the first question will go to Marie Madison, who is the Interim Executive Director for Women United Together in the Marshall Islands. And she is online Zoom up on the screen. The first question for you, Marie. Violence against women and girls is often referred to as the worst violation of their human rights. What can leaders do to scale up programs for the elimination of violence against women and girls?
First of all, I belong to the Reelwood clan, and I am from Woodme, Women United Together Marshall Islands, an umbrella organization for women that is formed by 24 chapters of women's clubs from throughout the Marshall Islands. Through this setup, we have at least 1,000 women members. Our founding members include our traditional women leaders and women who are from the government and the churches. The presidents of these chapters, the founding members, and the members of our executive committee form the Woodme Executive Board. Our executive committee includes 7 elected officers, 2 of them live in Ebi, former presidents and directors of Woodme, and advisors representing founding members and also a representative from the government. Our office is based here in Majuro, and we have 10 full-time staff, 8 part-time employees, 2 short-term staff, and a volunteer. The executive board meets annually and the executive committee meets on a quarterly basis. Our funds come from project grants, donations, raise funds, and membership fees. While we have been in existence since 1987, we became really functional in 2002 when we moved into a rented space paid by two of our paramount chiefs, Anjua Loyak and Imata Kadua, in the first 2 years. It is our common belief that goal that no woman should live in fear, but should be in control of her life and destiny. In our culture, a woman is the mother of a nation, the glue, the molder, the nurturer, the guide, the peacemaker, the defender, the weaver of the fabric of the Marshallese society. As a matrilineal society, land rights are passed on through the mothers, and land is tied to our clan system as it provides security, thus being safe and respected. The question then has been, why is violence against women, as in domestic violence, of high prevalence in RMI? What does it mean to destroy the weaver of a society, the glue, the defender of the clanship and the land? Woodme, which translates as your garland of flowers, has had the challenge as it stood and acted in behalf of the female members of the Marshallese Society since its establishment in 1987. The establishment of Woodme was supported by the government, traditional and church women leaders, 80 years before RMI became self-governing in May of 1979. The mission of Woodme was accepted and endorsed as important because with its makeup of 24 chapters from throughout the Republic, Woodme has had the network and the two-way outreach from national to the grassroots, from the grassroots upward, that could be tapped by the government or other agencies to expand services and to deliver and gather information. Thus, Woodme is an additional societal structure, a non-governmental network outreach that was immediately seen as complementing the leadership roles of government, traditional and church societal structures when dealing with societal issues. This is crucial when dealing with issues on health and education, the economy, and environment, and those resulting from teen pregnancies, truancy, youth suicides, and other societal deviations that spite cultural and traditional norms that are in violence of women and their rights. Gender equality in leadership, GEL, has been an ongoing theme in the work of Woodme, and this was promoted through Woodme's annual conferences and projects. Tying this theme to our traditional women roles has been the strategy. Tying this theme to the UN human rights was initially promoted through the Declaration of the Decade for Women during the TTPI time, while the Marshallese government was evolving to become self-governing in mid-1990s and 80s and up to the present time still evolving. Receiving the support of UN agencies and development partners directly or in collaboration with the government has been a form of institutional strengthening for Woodme and the promotion of women in the political world. Gender equality in leadership in the Marshall Islands was promoted through a variety of Woodme projects, like a voter education project that taught the public about not only voting rights that are embedded in the Constitution that do not disallow women to stand for office, and that women should be accepted and empowered to do so. In more recent times, the regional practice parliament workshops have been another promotional activities for women in politics. We use the imagery of the parts and the functions of our canoe, Marshallese canoe, where the booms that hold the sail that catches the wind and move the canoe forward are named as female and male booms. When referring to one's spouse, the name of the Marshallese canoe outrigger is used because without the outrigger, the boat sinks. One of the major Woodme projects that has been ongoing since 2003 is called Ajiri Inipunini, which is wholesome growth of a child. It is a parental education project targeting awareness of parents of children who are aged between 0 and 5. Training parent educators in early childhood development to reach out and work with parents at home on a monthly basis and in quarterly social settings where the parents and their children take part in additional educational or clinic activities. That is our Ajana Inipinini project, initially funded by US federal funds, but at present by the RMI government. Another WoodMe project that has been ongoing for a similar period has been a substance abuse prevention project. Lijwanchuri would call it, a US federally funded project that was initiated through the assistance of a newly created umbrella organization called Marshall Islands Council of NGOs, or MICNOs. WoodMe, along with other 4 non-governmental or NGOs, formed this structure to act as a clearinghouse for NGOs and share resources and expertise. Protecting the people, the land, the environment, and coordinating the related projects and activities is one of the roles of this new structure, and it has widened the outreach of WoodMe and the work on protection of human rights. Government recognizes and uses WoodMe, and now MICNOs, especially in the efforts of meeting universal human rights goals and requirements. As mentioned earlier, WoodMe has received support from government, UN, and development donation partners to help combat the issue of violence against women's rights, in addition to the promotion of gender equality. Of great importance is the present 6-year grant project funded by the Australian government through the Pacific Women Shaping Pacific Development, or Pacific Women program. This project has 2 components in its first 3 years: institutional strengthening and support services to spread awareness about domestic violence and the prevention of 2011 Act, and provide services to victims of domestic violence. Its second phase, the next 3 years, 3.5 years, has another target, which is economic empowerment for women. Under the present administration of RMI, the government started providing some funds to the Domestic Violence Support Services Project since fiscal year 2017, putting its national teeth to the Domestic Violence Prevention and Protection Act. Yet, to truly enforce the intent and outcome of this act is the rehabilitation services of perpetrators, which is yet to happen. In spite of all efforts to promote the rights of people, of women, through these means, there are challenges, particularly with the outmigration of Marshallese families. Uprooting of Marshallese families is not new, as was the outcome of World War II and the US nuclear testing program. But such migration of people, as it was with domestic adoptions, occurred mostly within our geographic Marshall Islands. When people ask WoodMe on the impact of climate change on women, the first thing that comes to mind is women being uprooted from their home base, their land rights, not only within RMI, but also outside the Marshall Islands. First, there were invasions challenging and changing our traditional way of being. And now such forces from education, health, needs, and also climate change uproot people and change our matrilineal-based society. Where is the home base, the land, and the clan? What happens to one's resources, relations, protection, and livelihood? The Marshallese word for community is chugujuk imper. The meaning is to dig in deep and exist and to belong. That is clanship, how you are identified, rooted, and tied to your land. You dig in through your mother. Therefore, traditionally and in modern times, women should be valued and not have their rights violated, especially if she is no longer in good control or becomes a resilient floater and brave, competent explorers. Kare Imankil is a term for women who are innovative and resourceful. So we want our women to be and remain resourceful, to be free from want. Promoting education and health has been a WoodMe goal that promotes women's rights for themselves and their families and clans here in the Marshall Islands and wherever they choose or are forced to live. Two of the traditional sayings about the role of Marshallese women are Karamen Nunak and Yep Chaltok. The first one is likens women to frigate birds because in flight it is still to fish to feed the youngs. The second one likens women to a basket that is always facing her family, her clan, her land. Programming to protect and enhance human rights and thus gender equality should happen through a balance and the interrelationship in research, instruction, and community extension services. The research could include those questions mentioned earlier, and this is yet to be fully realized. Instruction is gradually adapting to changes that we are seeing in the curriculum of the schools and the promotion of teaching on the culture, environment, and on human rights. Strengthening by making proper and effective adaptations to existing leadership and communal structures need major and urgent undertaking because our island lifestyle is being bombarded with challenges not under our control. Otherwise, the matrilineal system may even be further challenged as it has been had over the years and as evidence in the high number of victims from domestic violence, the violation of the home base, our roots, or Chinirilo Kubo, our guide, as Chinir Kuber. The present administration here in RMI has begun to formally support civil society organizations through the Marshall Islands Council of NGOs in funding and formal annual dialoguing in order to seriously collaborate in improving and extending effective services to various communities and individuals throughout the Republic. Due to the nature of its structure, WUDMI needs constant institutional strengthening. As an NGO, it is a voluntary body made up of 24 chapters and represents the 24 major Marshallese communities. Major operational and financial barriers are mostly related to transportation and communication. The strength of WUDMI structure relies heavily on the strength of each member chapter and each member club. The atoll chapters have to deal with intra-atoll transportation and communications as well. Thus, institutional strengthening is about advancing the capabilities of its members and their capacities as leaders and experts at the local and grassroots level as well. The annual WUDMI Executive Board meeting has had to secure at least $65,000 to make the annual event happen. The annual event is an opportunity utilized by a variety of sectors to touch base with these women leaders and sometimes local government councils and conduct awareness and public information activities. Every 3 years, we have our general assemblies, a bigger undertaking, a more expensive venture, but necessary since WUDMI elections and also needed changes to the WUDMI bylaws occur at such times. I would like to commend governments and agencies that have supported and guided WUDMI since its inception. I thank the government of Australia for the 6 years support, financial support to the WUDMI Eden Magwin Wado and More project, which is the support services for domestic violence here. This project has two major components, as I said earlier. Its second phase, as I said earlier, is on economic empowerment, a component that is needed to build the resiliency of victims and survivors of domestic violence. I commend the government of RC Taiwan for the $1 million donation launched yesterday to empower the economy of the country through its women entrepreneurs. The combination of the two funds, plus the newly launched project entitled Building Prosperity for Women Producers, Processors, and Women-Owned Businesses Through Organic Value Chains, shortcut is VPWP, should be able to build and maintain institutional capacities while empowering women against violence and poverty. Aside from the multi-year grant from Australia, which comes through the Pacific Women, the other Women WUDMI grant projects are annually financed by and through the governments of RMI and US. Sustaining adequate support together through MIGNOS would mean to address gaps in services, network, and outreach will rely on the strategic priorities of the government as well. So I would like to close by expressing my appreciation to be part of this first Women Leaders Coalition virtual conference, and to the co-host of the two presidents of RMI and ROC Taiwan. Also to the committee that has been helping to organize this. I close this with a translation of the song that was sung yesterday by the women during the opening session. And the English translation of that song goes like this. At the dawning of a new day, the women rise to face oncoming challenges. No matter the confused and agitated stage of activities, a nurturing mother has the inherent skill to deal with them as she marks the shifts of the wind in order to prevent losing control of the sail line as she drags her canoe away from the reef of danger, as she prepares for the mounting troubled surge in order to serve atop colliding tidal currents. Umaldara.
Thank you very much, Marie, for sharing information about how civil society can contribute to addressing gender-based violence against women and girls. The next question goes to our two other panelists, and then we'll come to a video from the Honourable Assistant Minister Anne Ruston of Australia. So the next question goes to Ms. Savina Nongabatu, who's the Deputy CEO of the Pacific Disability Forum, and she is joining us from Suva, and to Malinia Nawandra from the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, who is joining us from upstairs. So this question goes to both of you, but I understand Malinia will first answer the question, and then Savina, and then we'll have a short video to round out the answer. Women living with disability face multiple intersecting violations of their rights and issues, such as the right to be educated and to earn a fair and equal wage. What do you consider to be the priority actions leaders can take to promote and protect the human rights of women living with disability? Malinia?
Opportunity to be part of this wonderful conference and platform recognizing the role of women leaders in progressing development in our blue continent. I'd like to just briefly outline the policy frameworks that exist and provide a platform for leaders to ensure the inclusion of women with disabilities. Over the last 5 or so years, Pacific leaders have shown strong commitment towards the inclusion of persons with disabilities through the endorsement of the Pacific Framework on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2016, and the large number of Pacific Island countries that have ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. 13 Pacific countries have ratified this convention to date. The Pacific Framework on the Rights of Persons with Disability contextualizes the CRPD to the Pacific as both an instrument of human rights and of social and economic development. It focuses on the central role of persons with disabilities through their representative organizations, remaining true to the spirit of the CRPD, which is nothing about us without us. This is particularly relevant in the context of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which emphasizes the importance of addressing inequalities, discrimination and inclusion and exclusion, and ensuring that no one is left behind. So why is this important? It actually demonstrates that we have regional policy frameworks to support our leaders to ensure that persons with disabilities, particularly women with disabilities, are active participants in national and regional development. To date, there have been significant progress in awareness raising and engagement between governments and DPOs. There are good practices in data collection, in inclusive education, health, community-based inclusive development, social protection, women's empowerment, disaster risk reduction, and humanitarian response, amongst others. However, despite this progress, there's still much to be done to move from recognition to realization of the rights of persons with disabilities, particularly women and girls with disabilities. Persons with disabilities in our countries are among the poorest and most marginalized members of the community. They are overrepresented among people living in poverty and underrepresented in social, economic, and public life, including in national decision making, and generally have lower economic, health, and education outcomes. The situation for women with disabilities is worse. They face multiple layers of discrimination based on their disability and gender, and have fewer opportunities for inclusion and participation than the rest of the population. They're often denied access to education and employment opportunities and are at higher risk of violence and abuse. Disability is low on national policy agendas and receive very little in national budgetary resources, though this is improving in most of our countries. And as we journey towards achieving the 2030 agenda, we need our leaders to lead the move from recognition to realization, putting to action the commitments that have been made. Our leaders have committed to a region of peace, harmony, security, social inclusion, and economic prosperity so that all Pacific people can lead free, healthy, and productive lives. All of us need to work together with our leaders at the helm to realize this. And in keeping with our Blue Pacific spirit, we know together we can achieve great things for our Pacific people, including our women with disabilities, leaving no one behind. So what can our leaders do to accelerate the effort for greater protection of the rights of women with disabilities to move from recognition to realization? I'll hand over now to Savina, who is joining us from Suva to provide her reflections. Savina.
Thank you, Mel. So I'm speaking on behalf of the Pacific Disability Forum. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear? Okay. So the Pacific Disability Forum is an organization of and for persons with disabilities. We are based in Suva. Our work is mainly on advocacy for the rights of persons with disabilities. Within the framework of Pacific Disability Forum, we have made sure that gender cuts through the structures of Pacific Disability Forum. So we do have a board, we have a male co-chair and a female co-chair. And these two co-chairs also head the youth committee and also the women's committee. Now, Pacific Disability Forum has for the last 15 years been working very hard with regional partners, but also governments, as Mel has alluded to earlier. The work that we do around the rights of persons with disabilities is never ending, but also the Pacific Disability Forum is the voice of persons with disability in the region. There are three things that I wanted to highlight, and I think are priorities for persons with disability in the Pacific. Now, whilst Mel has alluded to the Pacific regionalism, the framework for rights of persons with disabilities in the region, these are all frameworks that have contributed to realizing the rights of persons with disabilities. But there are still gaps that advocates like ourselves, or organizations like PDF, still advocate for. One particular gap is and I think it's a priority for regional leaders, is to take into account accessibility. Now, when we say accessibility, accessibility to us is a precondition to inclusion. When I say accessibility, I mean, one, it could be infrastructure, it could be information, it could be communication. Now, it is known around our region that most of our countries do not have standard infrastructure standards that are available. I know Marshall has, and also Samoa has. But the important thing about accessibility is this, and I will give you an example. For women with disabilities, I think access a clinic, the government might build a clinic, a beautiful looking clinic. But if it's not accessible to a woman with in a wheelchair, if it's not accessible to a blind girl, in terms of communication and information, and also to a mute or deaf girl with a disability, then these are all, I guess, in a way, a discrimination to their right. We have had a research that we call accessibility blueprints, where we've had our members in various countries going around to do access audits. And we believe that the region needs a accessibility blueprint that can be contextualized to each countries. And this is one thing that we, as PDF, as an organization, is really pushing forward for an accessible blueprint. The other issue that I would like to raise here is data. Of course, there's a lot of data that we have around the region, and increasingly so because of the SDG and other regional frameworks and commitments that our governments have. However, there still remains to be seen that women with disabilities or disaggregated data is not available on many occasions. So this for us is also an area that we would like to highlight to the region, to leaders, to partners, to also think about the disaggregation of data. In our advocacy work, we have advocated for the Washington questions to be included in national census, and this has happened in 6 countries so far. But there is still very much a need for these Washington questions to be used to collect disaggregated data. Lastly, but not the least, I think it is no secret, like Mel said, women with disabilities tend to suffer, 3 or 4 times more than our other peers without disability. And whilst we have regional frameworks that are in place, that are used by our governments, and we also use them for our advocacy purposes, I think it is no secret that women with disabilities are still left behind in decision making, but also being able to participate in whether it be national or regional spaces. So I think my third call and priority, and I think a challenge for all of us and for all of you colleagues out there, is the inclusion of women with disabilities, whether it be in communities, villages, or meeting huts, manabas, or in the government halls of decision making. So I think that is my third call. So first, I would like to see accessibility prioritized, and that's access to service, information, communication, and all that. Secondly, it's disaggregation data where, and I think it is only fair that the government knows, its population by gender, by disability, by all the other areas, for it to also be better planned for its policies and budgets for that cause. And thirdly, for the inclusion of women with disabilities, whether it be on the community level, national level, regional, and of course at the international level. So these are my 3 priorities that I would like to share, and I hope that each and every one of us do take note of this, and also in so doing, you are actually, leaving no one behind, but also sharing the space with women with disabilities in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Melinia and Savina, for sharing your thoughts and to reminding us to ensure that when we discuss women's human rights, that we are ensuring that we include women with disabilities. Do we have the video ready to play? Okay.
Specialisation than those in urban settings. In the agriculture sector, women do half the work, yet they often face barriers to accessing credit, owning property and making financial decisions. We must ensure rural women have access to markets and the rewards of their own labour. This is because women's economic empowerment is not Clearly, women and girls who live in rural and remote areas face greater social and economic marginalisation than those in urban settings. In the agriculture sector, women do half the work, yet they often face barriers to accessing credit, owning property and making financial decisions. We must ensure rural women have access to markets.
Sit on.
Talo Falawa. My name is Mata'afafa Atino Tumapo, the General Manager for the National Advocacy Organization of Persons with Disabilities in Samoa. I am representing the disability community in the CSW 63 as part of your coming delegation.
My name is Savai Ratinai. I'm representing the Fiji Disabled People's Federation as their project coordinator. I'm here with Fatima, attending the Commission on the Status of Women 63 here in New York. What does it mean to be fully participated in society as women with disabilities? To be fully participated in society in an equal basis with others, it gives women with disability the freedom of their own choices and access to quality and affordable and accessible services. Also viewing that we are the center of any development, example in education, health, and accessing to justice. We women with disabilities somehow faces a lot of challenges. This due to stigma and discrimination, also inaccessible services in all areas. In many contexts, there are domestic laws and policies on access to justice, gender equality, gender-based violence prevention, and disability inclusion. However, these laws and policies often do not adequately guarantee the equal rights of women and girls with disabilities and do not address their diverse needs. We are often denied equal enjoyment of our human rights due to stigma and discrimination. We also experience violence in the workplace, and we are often in greater risk both within and outside our homes, as we are more vulnerable as victims of crime from both strangers and people who we know. To ensure recognition to the realization of gender and rights for women and girls with disabilities, we should consider how to tackle the stigma and stereotype faced by women and girls with disability. This can be achieved by training community members, religious leaders, legal professionals, and women rights advocates and activists. Also ensuring legal policy reforms initiative on the prevention of gender-based violence against women with disabilities. Addressing the inclusion of women with disability in compliance with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and CEDAW. This includes gender equalities policy and laws, equality and non-discrimination framework, and national disability laws and policies. The inclusion of women and girls with disabilities, taking into account their diverse needs, including marginalized groups such as women and girls with intellectual, psychosocial, deafblind, and multiple disabilities.
As a woman with a disability, I acknowledge the many commitments by our leaders to enhance the quality of lives of persons with disabilities with great appreciation. This, for instance, through the ratification of the International Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the adoption of the framework on the rights of persons with disabilities, the many regulatory frameworks, data collection, to name a few. This signified the commitments by our governments to ensure that persons with disabilities and their rights are included and recognized. However, we need to go 3 steps forward in order to make sure that these commitments are translated into actions that will make meaningful results for women and girls with disabilities, for instance. For far too long, we have been talking about inclusion on paper. But as women with disabilities, we want not just in paper, but we want to ensure that there are actions. As women with disabilities, our challenges, successes, just like all other women, need to be included and recognized. And there should be actions to ensure that these commitments to realize the rights of persons with disabilities are taken to the next level, as disability should no longer be a business as usual. What does that mean? It means fully inclusion of women and girls with disabilities in the design, the implementation, and monitoring of processes impacting their lives. It also means that the efforts to ensure the quality of lives of all citizens are not leaving behind the experiences and challenges of women and girls with disabilities, as only then we will ensure that the concept of not leaving anyone behind is recognized and realized. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll hear a video from the Honourable Assistant Minister Anne Ruston of Australia, responding to the question on rights of women and their families living in remote or rural areas who are often noted as requiring special attention in human rights processes. And the question for Minister Ruston was, what are some effective remedies to promote the human rights of rural women?
Clearly, women and girls who live in rural and remote areas face greater social and economic marginalisation than those in urban settings. In the agriculture sector, women do half the work, yet they often face barriers to accessing credit, owning property and making financial decisions. We must ensure rural women have access to markets and the rewards of their own labour. This is because women's economic empowerment is not only fair and right, but a sure road to stronger communities and economies. The Australian Government is committed to working with all Pacific nations to improve opportunities for women who live outside our major cities and towns. Through the Pacific Financial Inclusion Program, Australia and other partners have enabled around 800,000 Pacific women to access financial services. This includes village-level financial literacy programs, savings clubs and microfinance. We're also partnering with UN Women on the Markets for Change program in Fiji, the Solomon Islands and Vanuatu. This has made marketplaces safer and vendor associations more inclusive of women. And as a member of the UN Human Rights Council, Australia has made statements and resolutions to advance women's economic empowerment and amplify women's voices in decision making. But government initiatives are only part of the way forward. Businesses must also look at how they can provide safe, equal and fair employment opportunities that account for the realities of women's lives. That includes the fact that women still typically shoulder much of the burden of caring for others. Women have so much to offer. Women who have a job and earn a fair income can help to deliver economic development and build societies in which people, all people, women and men, can exercise fundamental rights.
Hey, thank you. And just to say that we are grateful for those who have recorded videos in advance, and so that we can add those to these discussions today. And a reminder to our online audience to please submit your questions now through the Facebook page. We are now joined by Ms. Marcella Jack, who is a private attorney in Pohnpei, in FSM. So my next question goes to Marcella regarding Sustainable Development Goal Target 5.1, which calls for the end of all forms of discrimination against all women and girls everywhere. What do you consider as the most important or essential legal frameworks needed to promote, enforce, and monitor equality and non-discrimination on the basis of sex?
Good morning to you from Pohnpei FSM. Thank you for the question, Rhea. I believe that one of the significant aspects that we're missing in although we've made progress on this front, is looking at peace building effort. Peace building in the sense that we have education at all levels of society so that both men and women, girls and boys understand the issue from the get-go. We tend to wait until they're older to see if we can run awareness raising programs. At that time, everyone is already fixed on what they believe is the right thing to do. I believe that if we do comprehensive and holistic approach through peace building effort, where we start teaching at an early age that people need to start respecting each other, then I think we can come to perhaps a better stage than where we are today. Legislation is not enough. We have to have support services. We have to have the courts in on it. We have to have increased law enforcement, education at all levels. I believe that is key to ensuring that people understand this process about gender equality at traditional levels, at in the homes, at the school, even in church, especially in church too. So I think that's where we need to start looking at peace building because peace promotes equality. Thank you very much.
And again, for driving the point home about the importance of education in addressing women's rights. We have a question online that is for Marie. And the question is, with regards to our Marshallese matrilineal system and women's rights, how does the Marshallese matrilineal culture affect women's political participation?
Well, as I said earlier, there are different roles in our tradition and custom that would sort of channel us into the different careers that we choose in life and in government, for example, in decision-making bodies. Because as I mentioned several of them, and one of them is Jinet Kubir, which has to do with trying to guide the family, a steerer of a family, a clan. And that calls for leadership skills, strengthening of the leadership role in that traditional framework. So there are different, like this one, the name of this fund that was just launched, Kareman Kul, that means that calls the women to be resourceful. When the difficult challenges come across, they're supposed to find ways to deal with it and get over it. And that's what decision makers are supposed to do, to take care of the clan and the nation. So that's a stage for the women to get into. So the culture does not, in fact, it enhances if the women and the people know the traditional roles and the values of the tradition, the cultural values, because the cultural values also have to do with respect for each other, take care with each other, and because we need to each other to survive. So it's not just one gender taking advantage of this and making all the decisions. You need balance. That's why I brought up the the image and the function of the parts of the canoe that makes the balance of the canoe and also moves the canoe forward. So there's a role that says the woman, I mean the balance of the canoe, wagu wajimur, that's working together, both men and women, to move the nation together and protect the nation together. So the culture is not that far from what we're doing, trying to do with human rights and women's rights as well. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. And now we can take some questions. Does anyone have a question for any of the panelists?
Testing. Thank you. First of all, my name is Biram Stegi, and I work in one of the private schools here on Natural, Assumption School. Since the topic that has been discussed is gender and human rights, I'd like to address a discussion that has been going on very heatedly in the Marshall Islands right now. And this has to do with the right to vote under our Aramaic Constitution. This right is given to every citizen of the Marshall Islands, in spite of where they live, whether it's here or outside of the Marshall Islands. As you know, this right is now not available to Marshallese who are living especially overseas in the US, in other places, because postal ballot now is not being allowed, it's being outlawed with the passage of Bill number 6 by the NDHLI. So it seems to me that a very basic right, which is the right to have your voice, to be to be able to vote on the ballot, especially because our election here is going to be in November this year. There's a group of us women here in the Marshall Islands who are trying to, we have made an effort to try and bring it up to our legislation, to reconsider, to see if there's something we can do, because we believe that to take away this right is very illegal and it's not under our Constitution, as it is mandated that if you are a Marshallese citizen, you have a right to vote. It is not a privilege. So I don't know. I guess I would like to ask the panel. This is something that affects human rights, and I firmly believe this is not political. It is not a political issue. It is a human right issue. Many Marshallese, maybe many of the women, about close to a third of the population of the Marshall Islands now resides overseas, especially in the United States. There have been many reasons why our Nidichala decided to take away this right from some of our citizens. You know, reasons that maybe are right, but also in our Constitution it says that our government and our Nidichala needs to find ways to make it possible. So if there were difficulties, if there were problems, if there were issues with regard to postal ballot, then it is the duty of our government to find ways to resolve those and to make it possible, not to make it impossible for people not to vote. So my question to the panel is, do you see this as going against, we've been talking about not, discrimination, especially for women in this particular conference about right of women, which some of these women, to be able to come to Metro to cast their vote, it's a real hardship because it's cost. Who can afford a ticket, even if it's from Honolulu? It's over $1,000. Who can afford that to fly here so that they can vote? But that is the only way they can vote right now, is to come back to the Marshall Islands to cast their ballot. So I would like to ask the panel, I don't know which countries, what do your countries do in terms of your citizens who are abroad? I know that there are some countries who don't allow their citizens to vote. And I don't know what their constitutions say. But our Constitution does not say if you live overseas, you cannot vote. It says every citizen has a right to vote. So my question to you, you think this is against what you've been talking about today? About opportunities, about right, whether you're a man or a woman? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Biram. Thank you, Congresswoman, Congresswoman Radhawanan, do you want to follow up on that
And then
question?
I'll put the
And then
issue
I'll
to the
put the
panelists for
issue to the
discussion.
panelists for discussion.
Yes, thank you. I don't have an answer to her question. All I can tell you is what we do in American Samoa. And those who can vote on the island have to be residents there. The only people who can vote off island now are soldiers in the military. In fact, we make it so easy for them, particularly if they are in the Middle East, they can actually email in order to get registered to vote. The other crowd that can vote off island are college and university students, and that's it. And of course, federal employees who perhaps, such as my congressional staff, I have 15 American Samoans on my staff, and they are working in Washington, but they are voting residents in American Samoa. But we've wrestled with this question for years, but right now that seems to work for the people of American Samoa, is not allowing anybody else except these particular 2 or 3 groups to vote off island. Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman. So for the panel, the question relates to the right to vote and whether restricting or placing limitations on that right constitutes a form of discrimination against women or, more broadly, a violation of a human right. The question was posed in the context of what is currently happening in the Marshall Islands, where postal ballots are no longer accepted. Panelist has Can I get a clarification from the panel whether you can hear my, can you hear me?
conversations that were happening earlier.
Okay, I also typed the question here for the panel in the. Does anyone want to address the issue of voting rights and the restrictions on voting rights?
We couldn't hear. It's not very clear what's coming through.
Okay, I think rather than us try to struggle with the technology at this point, I might wrap up this discussion. I thank the Congresswoman for providing a response to Gurum's question. Are there any other questions from the audience at this time? Yes, Minister?
I just want to make a comment in sort of response to the question posed about voting rights. In Palau, we used to send ballots overseas for a while. It became costly, as well as sometimes irregularities, and so that was stopped, and we just started to deal with absentee ballots. We recognize that everyone has the right to vote, so absentee ballots, and they would be sent off. People overseas would request absentee ballots to the Election Commission. And so, and now with online, they can apply and register first before the ballots are sent. The ballots are sent physical through postal services. However, so they would be sent to Guam, CNMI, Guam, and Hawaii, and the United States. Now there is a move to stop that. The reason being that Palauans overseas don't really know or aware of the issues that are being discussed at home. And sometimes they make a difference in the election. And so there is now a move in Palau to say we need to not allow Palauans overseas to vote. They chose to leave. They're paying taxes where they are. They work there, and they're not aware of issues back home to really deal with the election or voting. So that is now being discussed, and it has not been officially adopted. So still, there's still absentee ballots that are being sent if you request. I just kind of make a comment on that one. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Minister.
Okay.
Okay, we need to conclude this session. I want to thank the panelists for your participation, for the questions. I'm sorry, former speaker, Juan Pat.
I have a question. I'm a believer, of course, of universal education regardless of gender. So the question I have for the panelists, because I'm almost sure that in their own respective countries, that they have private schools where they are either all male private schools or all female private schools, and I don't know what the curriculum is, and it's interesting to know because we know that women, male and female leadership styles are very different. And since a lot of it, I know Marstella basically was saying it's education, 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 and at a very early age. So, and I'm wondering is anyone monitoring the curriculum to really make sure that we are teaching equality? Or are we teaching our boys very differently from what we're teaching our girls? Because then we're seeing now their behavior, their beliefs are very different when they become adults, and maybe that's where we're seeing the inequities.
Thank you, former speaker.
Thank you, former speaker. Did our panelists hear that comment?
No, they did not.
No, they did not.
But I think you did.
But I think you did follow up on some important points that were raised earlier by some of our panelists, and that we've already heard um, in the conference up to this point, which is the importance of education and early education. And Marstella spoke about that in particular with educating our children at very young ages, so that we're not then having to address problems later through legislation, but that we're actually teaching and building a strong foundation. And I think the other strong points that were raised by our panelists was to ensure that when we are discussing women's rights and human rights, that we are remembering to include women with disabilities, women and girls with disabilities, and to focus on the issues of accessibility, desegregation, and inclusion. And then when we began this panel with the discussion from Marie from WUTMI, and she outlined the importance of civil society and the role that civil society and NGOs can play in working with women and especially in addressing violence against women and girls. So I want to thank all of the panelists for your contributions and for the discussion, for those who provided questions from the audience and also responses. Thank you again to everyone.
Thank you. We will take a short break as we set up for our next panel. Our next panel will be on the issue around women and health, moderated by Miss Milenia Nawandra, advisor from the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat. Please remember that we still have our poll, whether you see value in a Pacific Women Leaders Coalition. Please visit the Facebook page as well as the Twitter and cast your vote on whether you see value in a creation of the Pacific Women Leaders Coalition. And again, as panels run, you may post or make your comments on the Facebook page as well as the comment text box on the website. And if you're watching on the YouTube channel, you may also comment your questions there, and we will pass them along to moderators. If questions are not answered during the session, these questions will be passed on to the media team to pose as they interview the panelists. Yeah, I see it.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can you all hear me? Can you all hear me now? Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A special welcome to all of you here this afternoon, and to those of you joining us online. Welcome. This is the third and final panel for the conference, and it's focused on a special issue of gender and health. Sustainable Development Goal 3 aspires for health for all at all ages. Universal quality health coverage is a huge challenge in our blue Pacific continent, particularly for remote, rural, and maritime communities. Biological and gender-based differences result in different health risks and health needs for women. Basically, our biology allows us to escape certain health problems. However, most health conditions affect both men and women in varying degrees and ways. Women have more difficulty than men in accessing the health care they need, with barriers including lack of transport or funds for transport to the clinic to receive medication or for consultation with doctors or nurses, or child care responsibilities. Some Pacific Island countries are reporting increased incidence of poverty related to diseases, and we don't know much at all about the economic impacts of ill health and diseases. But we know that national health systems constantly juggle limited resources to deliver preventative and curative services. Universal health coverage will take different shapes in different countries and move in different directions at different speeds, but cannot be achieved anywhere without addressing gender equality and particularly the role of women in health. In practical terms, for women and girls, it means access to primary health services such as routine health screenings, family planning, and vaccinations. We have 6 distinguished panelists to provide their insight on this very important topic. To our online audience, if you have any questions or comments for the panel, please submit them now so when the panelists finish speaking, we can move straight into an online discussion. And also a reminder to not to forget to vote in the poll that on do you see value in a Pacific Women Leaders Coalition. So you can go to our Facebook page to vote or retweet, and votes will be counted at the end of this session. Thank you. So let's get straight into it. Our first speaker this afternoon is Dr. Audrey Alma, who is the Deputy Director General of the Pacific Community, and she is joining us live online from Suva. Yakwe, Deputy Director General. I'll ask you your question now. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Audrey? I think she's unable to get a lot of feedback. I think she's got feedback in her. Here, I've got my. Oh, right. Can you hear us, Deputy Director General? Okay. So our question to you this afternoon, sorry, is as we are acutely aware, non-communicable diseases are at epidemic levels in the Pacific region. Dr. Alma, please share with us your thoughts or ideas about how the Pacific Women Leaders Coalition can support existing programs on NCDs or develop new ones to reduce the incidence of NCDs. Dr. Alma. I don't think she can still hear me. Oh, yeah.
Good morning.
Oh, good morning. Yes.
Tanaka. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Can the audience hear Deputy Director General?
Okay. Nissan Bulavinaka, good morning. I am struggling a little bit to, I can now, thank you. I am just struggling. Thank you, Millennia. Thank you. Millennia, thank you very much. And good morning, everyone. Excellency, the Honourable President of the Marshall Islands, Dr. Hilda Heine. Excellency Tsai Ing-wen, women leaders and participants of this very important meeting. Thank you for the invitation to join this morning, and let me convey my congratulations at the outset to Her Excellency the President on this initiative and the coalition members for the work and preparation that has gone into the organisation of this meeting. Yesterday, I attended the first day of the Pacific Women in Power Forum in Nandi, where Pacific Women in Parliament had gathered together to discuss really critical issues and challenges in promoting women in politics. So it feels that our region this week is alive with women voices. Just turning to the question that's being posed to me, as you know, the burden of NCDs is known to us all, and we see this disease on a daily basis in our families and, of course, in our communities. We, the members of our communities, really struggle with conditions such as diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, of course, obesity and cancers of various kinds, both in our families and, of course, in our communities. NCDs account for around 70 to 75% of all deaths in the Pacific, and many of these NCD-related deaths are premature. And by that I mean many of us die prematurely, often before the age of 60. And these deaths, of course, are preventable. Most of the trends and the risk factors point to a worsening of the situation, and the Pacific, unfortunately, seems to feature in the top 10 countries with some of the highest rates of diabetes in the world. NCDs have been the leading causes of death among women globally for at least the past 3 decades, and are responsible now, I think, in the region for 2 in every 3 deaths among women in each year. This burden is expected to increase substantially in the coming decades, especially in the low and middle income countries. The really big prevalence indicators that we look for in trying to understand the significance and the burden of this issue are in areas such as smoking, lack of physical activity, alcohol, nutrition, and of course we're acutely aware of the growing issues around obesity. The global data tells us that the risk factors for heart disease and stroke are the biggest causes of premature death for women. We also know a lot more about the impact of NCDs on our communities and, of course, in particular, women. And the impact in particular on NCDs and the exacerbation of poverty and the condition of women from a poverty perspective. We are seeing much more now, I think, members of our community who are dying much earlier, but also much younger. We are also seeing a growing number of major disabilities in the communities, and I was quite struck by Savina's comments around the issue of disability and the growing burden there and the limited access of services for those with disabilities. And I was very supportive of her comment around the need for a disability blueprint. So the effect of NCDs on women in particular, I think, just not from the disease side, but also important, I think it's to highlight the issues of economic wellness. And women, of course, are affected by the expenses of treatment costs for NCDs. Women leave work to be carers for their families, and of course, this has another financial impact. Children often leave school early to care for members of their household. Money often that could be used for families is often spent on tobacco and alcohol and other needs. I think we're beginning to also recognize that from a broader health system perspective, the cost implications for governments are very significant. NCDs impose very large but often preventable financial costs on already overstretched government health budgets. And we're recognizing already in the region that several NCD-related programs are already unsustainable financially. Most countries in the region are struggling to keep up with the costs related to drugs for people, for areas such as diabetes, but in particular high cholesterol, insulin costs, and of course dialysis. And we do know that the burden of NCDs and the burden on the escalating costs of our health system are expected to rise. And in all of that, I think there's sufficient data for us to understand that the NCDs affect women inequitably much more than people actually think. So this leads me to what role the coalition can play in strengthening, I think, both community response, but also the political response. And I think the wonderful thing the coalition could consider is what I seem to be understanding here is the ability to convene high-level leadership. High-level sustained leadership, I think, to continue to focus on awareness and shining the light on issues related to NCDs, and particularly on focus on improving education and awareness, both alcohol, smoking, salt reduction, and of course, poor nutrition. I think the issue of nutrition and access to good food, and in particular food security, is of course much more exacerbated because of the context of climate change and the conditions of the environment, of course, that are impacting on access to good food. There are multiple factors inside and outside the health sector that are driving the rise in NCDs. So I think a multi-sectoral approach is essential. Health challenges that involve factors beyond the health sector include, of course, the availability of water and sanitation, the level and quality of girls' education, domestic violence issues, and of course, mental health and disability, and what we've heard this morning, challenges around human rights. We often hear that it is the individual choices, and this is a common aspect of discussion and dialogue, but we hear that the individual choice that people make in related to unhealthy choices and therefore issues related to NCDs should be about focusing on the individual. And while that is true, I think there is certainly a significant component of individual poor choice, but it really is critical to recognize the role of the environment and what the role the environment does play. Failure, I think, to recognize this often results in many missed opportunities. In fact, it makes addressing NCDs near impossible. So the role, I think, of the coalition could be critical in this space, which is about bringing awareness to many other determining elements of NCDs, such as legislation, such as the enabling health services, better information and knowledge. And maybe just to speak a little bit about legislation, and I think the focus that the coalition could make is around the issue of tobacco control and the importance of ensuring that good legislation is in place. The ability for women to lobby in this particular, I think, is paramount. Issues around legislation, for instance, for sugary drinks, poor food, and access to good food. And we're beginning to see a lot of evidence in other countries where tobacco control is an excellent entry point for NCD prevention. We're recognizing that, that regular and substantial increases in the prices of tobacco, plain packaging of tobacco products, is actually demonstrating that it has opened up a new phase of a fight against the tobacco industry. Just to also point out, and again for consideration by the coalition, that all Pacific countries have an NCD roadmap, and this is a detailed plan that guides the actions and strategies for all members and for all countries to escalate the implementation of combating NCDs. And at a political level, I think the coalition could play a substantial role, I think, in shining the light on the NCD roadmap and the investments and the aspects of the work that relate to the implementation of this roadmap. I think mobilizing national policymakers, civil society, to advocate for national health policies and, of course, financing that drive gender-specific responses for policy and, of course, for access to health services. The final area that I think I'd like to highlight is about the strengthening of primary healthcare for women and pushing for programs that improve access to health services for women, championing policies that ensure equity and access. There's an increasing recognition of the importance of the life course approach to the prevention of NCDs, beginning with the health of girls and young women before and during pregnancy. The integration of NCD prevention activities, for example, into maternal and women-centric health programs, really has a lot of potential. Generally, there is poor access to care for women, girls and other vulnerable groups affected by NCDs, and in many societies in our region, women lack control over resources and hence cannot afford quality care of NCDs. So there are many other social, cultural and geographic and economic barriers for women to access good care. There are multiple factors inside and beyond the health sector, of course, that are driving the rise in NCDs, so a multi-sectoral approach is essential. Health challenges that involve factors beyond the health sector include issues such as the availability of water and sanitation, the level and quality of girls' education, and of course, issues around domestic violence and mental health. I want to also propose maybe that the coalition could really begin to shine the light on the importance of working and stimulating local food, access to local food, and supporting the agricultural sector, I think, and stimulating economic livelihood from an agricultural and, of course, fisheries perspective. These are areas where I think women play quite a central part and therefore control some of the decision-making around access to good food for their families. So given women's capacity as change agents and decision makers on health and families, I think it's the ability for strong advocates on development issues and the fact that we are adversely affected by NCDs. I think the Pacific Women Leaders Coalition should really find increased opportunity for both engaging and mobilizing opportunities for prevention and control of NCDs. It seems to me that the Sustainable Development Goals agenda is hugely hampered in our region because of the inability for us to combat NCDs and, of course, the impact that it has on our communities and our ability for a physical and well and productive life. So, Melanie, I might just stop there. And as I'm getting quite a lot of echo feedback, but to maybe just to end my initial comments there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alma, for that insight into NCDs and how we can the incidence of NCDs. I'll go straight into to our second speaker now, who is Ms. Ria Moss Christian, who is the Commissioner for the RMI National Nuclear Commission. Yandavinaka, Commissioner. share some of the ongoing health impacts resulting from the US nuclear testing program and the ongoing impacts of nuclear testing in the Pacific.
Perhaps the most, I'll say, violent impact on women's health from the nuclear testing program has been related to reproductive health. This goes well beyond cancers and includes a number of other issues, including stories like the one I described in my opening statement yesterday. The UN Special Rapporteur, in his report in 2012, found that there was significant information suggesting that the full effects of radiation on the right to health of Marshallese women continues to be underestimated. And as an example, he cited the practice of women bathing in contaminated water that may have been overlooked as a possible means of exposure, and cultural differences that may have also resulted in inadequate accounting of adverse reproductive outcomes. Studies have shown that pregnant women are particularly susceptible to thyroid cancer, with resultant negative effects on the health of the women and their infants. The Special Rapporteur also heard compelling testimony by women on their experiences of returning, in this case from Rongelap Atoll, on the alarmingly high rates of stillbirths, miscarriages, congenital birth defects, and reproductive problems. Issues where there were previously known difficulties. Some gave birth to babies that ultimately died from fetal disorders, and they were still having to endure the shame and trauma of that experience as a result. The extent to which radionuclides were actually present in the breast milk of women exposed to the testing is still unclear, which makes it also difficult to assess the risks to individuals who were breastfed by those women. And this goes to the issue of genetic effects and multi-generational impacts of nuclear testing. And so while the impacts of women who were alive during the testing or in vitro during the testing period and may have suffered impacts, there's still a lot of information that is still unknown as to how future generations will be impacted. We've had 50 years of research on the effects of radioactivity on humans, which has been very male-dominated. The nuclear field is a very male-centric industry, I think for obvious reasons, but the research has been the same, has been very male-centric. So we've had about 50 years of research on the impacts of radioactivity on humans, and we still need another 50 years to understand how that impact will continue to manifest through generations. But more than the impact on women's physical health, bodily health, is the impact on the mental health and the mental well-being, and in turn, how that impacts the health of communities. We've already talked about the importance of women and the role that women play in the foundations and families, and that those families, healthy families, make for healthy communities and so on. And one of the biggest impacts of the nuclear testing program, as I said, was not just the bodily harm, which is a tragedy in itself, but was the cultural destruction that ultimately impacted women and then in turn impacted the health of entire communities, and will continue to affect those communities for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ria, for that insight. We'll go straight to our next speaker, third speaker. But before we do that, can I just remind our online audience, if you have any questions for our panelists, please submit them now through our Facebook page. So our third speaker this morning is Ms. Benalina Hedson, who is a clinical nurse supervisor, midwifery and breastfeeding focal point for Pohnpei State Hospital. Ms. Hedson is joining us live online. So if we can bring her up. Is she available online? Okay, so maybe we'll get on to our fourth speaker, who is Dr. Helentina Garstang, Director for the Republic of Marshall Islands Cancer Council of the Pacific Islands, CCPI.
One of the biggest impacts of the nuclear testing program, as I said, was not just the bodily harm, which is a tragedy in itself, but was the cultural destruction
Dr.
that ultimately impacted women, and then
as you know, only a small
impacted the health of entire
and curable cancers such as cervical and breast cancers are diagnosed.
Those communities for generations.
It's stage 1 in many Pacific Island countries. Can you outline some successful or promising practices to increase screening rates?
Thank you very much, Ria. So, yeah, Gwei.
For that insight. We'll
sorry, there's another recording online at the same time. So
before we do that, can I just remind our online audience, if you have any questions for our panelists, please submit them now through our Facebook page. So our third speaker this morning is Ms. Benalina.
So some fast facts about the 3 cancers that can be detected early through screening.
For Pohnpei State Hospital.
Number 1 in the Marshall Islands has the highest rate of cervical cancer in the world, with a crude incidence of 79.9 per 100,000 population. On the average, 10 cases of cervical cancer are diagnosed each year. 3 out of 4 diagnosed cervical cancer are in the late stage. 8 out of 10 female diagnosed cervical cancer die within the first year of diagnosis. And these all can be prevented through early detection by pap smear or VIA screening for cervical cancer. Second, the breast cancer, which is the third most common cancer in the Marshall Islands.
Program, as I said, was not just the bodily harm, which is a tragedy.
Third, colorectal cancer is the 6th most common cancer in the RMI.
Ultimately impacted.
Currently, we still have low cancer screening rates. Cervical cancer screening rates about 33.6% compared to in 2016, which was 27.14%. Breast cancer screening rate now is 22% compared to 2016, which was 20.6%. Colorectal cancer screening rate 7.99%, another decrease from 2016, which was 17.8%.
Can I just remind our online audience?
So what have we been doing in the RMI? Well, in the past 4 to 5 years, initially the major cancer screenings in the RMI were performed mainly during annual canvas back OBGYN team from 2014 to 2017. During these annual visits, which last about 2 weeks, more than 600 women are screened or evaluated for major reproductive ailments. So why are women not seeking 10 cases of cervical early diagnosed help when our culture are very close? We talk about close-knit family. 8 out of 10 female diagnosed cervical cancer. Maybe that's where within the first year, I can leave the audience to think about and discuss. And these all can be prevented. Is this because of the Western life that has affected us by pap smear or VIA? I'm not sure. So, cancer. There's a lot of gaps. Second, the breast cancer, which is the but allow me to talk about the low-lying fruit that we can work with. In other words, what does low-lying fruit cancer is the 6th most common. What are the gaps or challenges that the RMI Ministry of Health we still have low cancer can do to deal with the big burden that is affecting our grandmothers, our mothers, aunties, sisters, daughters, and even girlfriends, which was 27.14%. So these low-lying fruits can be cultural and taboo, 22%, limited human resources, limited skills and tools to work with the large and scattered population in the RMI, cancer screening rate, geographical or scattered atolls or islands, 2016, which was 17. From these barriers, MOHHS had to revisit and revamp its strategies on how we can deal with this past 4 to 5 years. Initially, the major these include support from the community, traditional leaders, church leaders, NGOs, businesses, and the government. We have been increasing our breast and cervical cancer screening rates more than I will attribute this mainly due to one, stronger community partnership in navigating women to screening services. The more women you screen, the higher chance you will catch cancer in early stages. Truly, our breast and cervical cancer screening show that we are not catching more cervical cancer in the early stage, but partnering with the women's groups and churches, along with the traditional leaders, have been promising. Second, the best practice is making breast and cervical cancer screening available after hours, as this will allow some working women to get screening services. And third, lastly, I think we are now doing much better compared to when I was here, when I first moved back in 2012 or 11, with advocacy. The president now, I'm happy to say it and I'm glad to brag about it, since we are the first in the Pacific Islands to have a woman leader and even the government leaders to now have a very supportive of cancer screening and really helping with the increase in the screening rates. They have launched our national screening campaign to increase our cancer screening. So in the past 4 to 5 years, initially the major. So the second way that we can improve our screening rates comes from the clinical support side. A letter of support from the Minister and Secretary of Health and Human Services for all clinicians and other health providers to actively participate in the screening initiative efforts that has been launched by the President. This means when a patient is seen at the health center, they will be encouraged or referred for screening based on the RMI national screening guidelines. Lastly, a better screening tool for colorectal cancer will replace the current tool that is not very sensitive in detecting colorectal cancer. Training for colonoscopy is also an ongoing issue right now. As we speak, one of our surgeons is currently in Ibai undergoing a training with the CAT scan team that are in Ibai. And third, training of mid-care providers to reach a community that are not able to seek health care due to the geographical scattered atolls, islands in the RMI. There are currently 12 nurse practitioners that are undergoing their internship. Their role as primary health care providers is the key to reach out to the unreachable population. To have a woman leader. And lastly, our future implementation. With the help from the National Nuclear Commission, MOHHS has been working with the agency PAP, Cervical Cancer Team, which is a new screening approach to effective, cost-effective, and sustainable for RMI. Is to adopt the new HPV testing by using the self-collected samples. This could be accomplished through distribution by the MOHHS staff or our partners, including the community health workers. The cotton swabs are given to the women to collect vaginal samples and drop it off in the lab. This means when a patient is seen at the health center, they will be encouraged or referred for screening based on the RMI national screening. From this method, the low-lying fruit of cultural, taboo, geographical location, financial constraints, busy schedule with what we ladies like to say, can be all fixed with this new method that the MOH will be implementing soon. I lead this discussion and thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Garstang. Our next speaker is Miss Valentina Tuelupe, who is the former Director General of Health, Chief Executive Officer, Ministry of Health in Samoa, and is the immediate former General Manager of National Health Service and Technical Advisor to the Samoan National Council of Women. Her message this afternoon will be read by Director of the Social Development Division of SPC, Leatuala Quiniselani Tango Elisara. Quiniselani.
Lava. I acknowledge the organizers' agreements for a substitute from Samoa on this session. The Honorable Deputy Prime Minister is attending a parallel conference overseas, hence allowing me this privilege. I want to congratulate the President of the Republic of the Marshall Islands, Her Excellency Dr. Hilda Heine, for convening the first virtual conference of the Pacific Women Leaders Coalition. Your theme, Leading Women Making a Difference, is highly commendable and most appropriate at a time when the regional women take notes of 25 years since the Pacific Women's Platform for Action was endorsed. The question I am given reiterates for us all the value in sustaining healthy living in preparation for disasters. It reminds us of the benefits in taking care of the basic prerequisites for health like peace, food, shelter, education, general sanitation, stable ecosystem, sustainable resources, social justice, and equity. These are the fundamental conditions that bring about the risks for disease outbreak after natural disasters. More than often, the risks that emanate from these basic needs are associated primarily with population displacement, the availability of safe water and sanitation facilities, the degree of overcrowding, the underlying health status of the people, the availability of healthcare services which all interact with the context of the local disease ecology to influence the risk for infectious disease outbreaks. Samoa's health sector aligns its ongoing prevention advice with the advocacy from disaster management experts on the four fundamental disaster risk management phases, namely risk reduction, risk preparedness, response, and recovery. So when a disaster strikes, the investments in primary health care and health promotion services come to play. We consistently repeat the prevention strategies that are in nature, risk reduction, disaster preparedness, and responsive. Disaster recovery then is quick and doable. People are encouraged to at least keep their shelters clean and dry, have some degree of healthy homes, clean kitchens, toilets, and general sanitation, ensure safety of young children and pregnant women, elderly and the vulnerable groups, store and boil drinking water, cook all food and try to avoid eating them raw, get rid of the debris and rubbish from immediate home environments. Lactating mothers are encouraged to continue breastfeeding, communities to accelerate their vector control efforts and be vigilant in avoiding waterborne diseases. Although some of our daily routine practices are understood, the prevention advice still emphasize to keep themselves clean and where there is water, shower at least once daily to avoid skin infections. And the last one being continue to brush teeth regularly to prevent dental problems. People suffering from NCDs are encouraged to look after their medication supplies,
and to avoid getting injured, what with their physical vulnerabilities. Mental health is an integral concern, and addressing disaster-related stress is also prevention of diseases. Communities are often quick to collectively rebuild demolished shelters. Likewise, male folks build temporary pit latrines for the obvious needs. This presentation is only 5 minutes, and I wish to highlight the benefits of multi-sectoral collaboration between government and non-government organizations within Samoa, which brought about a consensual drive to preventing disease outbreak as one of our collective priorities. The successful prevention of disease outbreaks in Samoa during the most recent disasters was not due to a health sector sole effort. It was every other sector's input. Communities were just as stringent with what they could do, and there were no major outbreaks in Samoa as a result. I thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Queen Isilani, for reading out Palentina's message. So now we'll go straight into a couple of videos. The first video is a message from Associate Professor Yvonne Underhill-Sam of the University of Auckland in New Zealand. Associate Professor Sam will talk about gender justice in health based on her family experience.
Kia ora tātou katoa. Delighted to meet you. My name is Yvonne Underhill-Sam, and I'm delighted to be part of this inaugural conference. Kia ora tātou katoa. Delighted to meet you. My name is Yvonne Underhill-Sam, and I'm delighted to be part of this inaugural conference. I'm coming to you from the University of Auckland, where I'm an Associate Professor in Development Studies, and I'm very keen to discuss a particular health issue that I think demonstrates how we need to understand health and development in the Pacific in a much more integrated way than we currently do. So the story I want to tell, I think, depicts the way in which we need to take into consideration the need and the demand and the interest and the commitment that many of our people have towards ensuring their young women and girls have the education that they deserve. I also will thread through that the issues around health and access to healthcare. And then on top of that, I also, there's a really big issue that is a pressing one for our region that we find it more and more difficult to leave out of any discussion, and that's the discussion around climate change. So I want to do this by telling a story and then to draw out some of the links that the story, I think, helps us to understand how these all link together. So in November 2012, a 20-year-old high school student called Malia, my niece, was admitted to a provincial hospital in Papua New Guinea. She'd fainted when she was sitting her last exams because of loss of blood during her monthly menstrual bleed. She'd had a disrupted high school year already in the last 2 years because of floods, which had destroyed access to her boarding school for 2 years in a row. The floods had destroyed the gardens as well, which were needed to feed about the 400 students in the boarding school that Malia was at. Malia was a promising, hard-working and determined student, and she wanted to complete her education, even if it meant, as it does for so many of our students, that she had to travel to a boarding and live at a boarding school many kilometres from her home. But she was determined to complete her education without adding further burden to her family, who were both semi-subsistence farmers. During the school holidays, she stayed with family who lived in an oil palm bog and earned pocket money by selling the peanuts that she'd planted. After about a week of hospital care, she returned with her mother to her home village, about 150 kilometres away from the hospital. 2 months later, after another heavy menstrual bleed, Malia died. She died in the local health sub-centre, lying in the arms of her father and surrounded by many members of her family. Now, this story is tragic, but emphasises the interrelated nature of tragedy in the Pacific and how young women, and women in particular, are often at the centre of that. It shows the context of development in the Pacific, where young people and their families want education and they want work, and they and their families are prepared to be mobile to gain access to education and healthcare. But there's always a gendered component to that that's always present, but often considered too raw or culturally awkward to be openly spoken of and addressed, and thus is silenced. Malia's death was tragic in many ways, beginning with the fact that it was preventable. I don't think she's the only one in high schools who have issues around menstrual regularity. There has been very little research in the Pacific done on that, but research that's been done in other developing countries, in India for example, speak to the many complicated ways in which young women's menstrual cycles are often disrupted by a range of different features and drivers and factors. But it highlights the significant gender-related problems in healthcare access and the delivery for young menstruating women in residential high schools in Papua New Guinea. And those residential high schools are the pathway for many of our young women to move into higher education and into work and into further leadership positions. But this story also raises issues relating to the ubiquitous environmental transformations that are ever present in the Pacific, due to modifications in land use and exacerbated by unquestionable changes in climate. If you add to this situation the dynamic ways in which cultural practices and religious beliefs contribute to the dilemmas faced by people as they seek to find the answers to the tragedies caused by a variety of these transformations. In the case of Malia's tragic death, all these factors were interlinked. So when you're trying retrospectively to diagnose the cause of Malia's death, we can't just look at the state of her young, apparently healthy, menstruating female body for answers. We've also got to look to the education system and ask why iron-rich food was not provided all year round, and to the health system, to ask why was she allowed to return to her village, which was so far away from a well-stocked health centre, and to her family, when many of whom were silent about her condition. Why did they prefer to not leave her where modern medicine could have been of assistance? So in the Pacific, any evaluation or the evaluation of any program or project must be understood in this wider interrelated context, and it must be able to accommodate multiple and differing ways of understanding well-being and causation. Addressing these interlinked issues requires consideration of at least 4 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. SDG 3, which talks about health, SDG 4, talking about education, SDG 5, talking about gender equality, and SDG 13, that talks about climate change. Clearly, dealing with these interrelated issues is not an easy task, but lives like Malia's are at stake, and I know we can do better. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for that video. We'll actually now go to our next video before we end this session and go to questions from our online audience. The next video that we'll be watching is called Kore in Okrane, Women of the Dawn.
Yahweh Nganolip. I am the president of KIO, or Karino Orane. KIO is a nonprofit charitable organization in the Marshall Islands. We were established in 2006. and our mission is to provide direct humanitarian and social assistance to Marshallese families, especially in marginalized areas in the Outer Islands. While our main target is women and girls, our projects directly impact the livelihoods of entire communities. Our two current projects have been especially important and integral for RMI to meet its commitment in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Our Smokeless Stove project addresses the adverse health impacts of traditional open cook stoves. Exposure to smoke from traditional cook stoves and open fires causes an estimated 1.9 million premature deaths annually throughout the world, with women and children the most affected. Traditional cook stoves contribute to a range of chronic illnesses and acute health impacts such as pneumonia, lung cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, cataracts, low birth weight, and other less obvious but equally real risks. Over 90% of women in the Marshall Islands use biomass-fueled cook stoves in poorly ventilated confined spaces called cookhouses or cook on open fires.
In yallo project in and smokeless stove, it chun project on me. Eladan chibang karay no the lo the ralan ko. Ijarero. Yung lo madeline ijarero. Dulu jaga lang mga kidan family yo. Smokeless stove in elungun ladan auruk boy. Eno tau kanale lagi. Ekariglak erro ko an karay. Ini cendan may wala ka kanigay. Yang mana kan bare jendura wancuan karay no the walak dari lo. Mun gugo ela da men no wi pato ko chala ka di smokeless stove erik an cito bagain ka jara pal kani yim am digay emaka jair kanapti mga ko no chuno me jara pal lo energy yim ngay jito tak pa non matanero ko jito tak ngan ko ila ko lo idalagen pasibigin no to bar jogo luk ya lo ay chon project ala dan gubay puro ka ini cuan mene gimana nain kijong pagalang adakam kanono kare.
And I am proud to say that KIO has distributed more than 2,000 smokeless stoves to our Outer Island communities. And it's through this project we hope we're able to empower families and lift them out of poverty. This project is the Renin Mill Water Filter Project. And this water filter project provides individual water filter systems to families in the Outer Islands. Clean water is vital to health, peace, and security of families in the Marshall Islands. And yet safe water is still out of reach for many families in the Marshalls. Clean water is a basic human right, and it is essential to the realization of other human rights. We hope to reach every single household in the Outer Islands.
Ma project in chuan project ko me para ka ba jane eno chuno mi judo ta ka ke ya ka ni do ta ka ke na Outer Island ko dilo ke la na ra mi ro ile ta ka ke bakka na ke poko dok ejmor te jala ka nge ejmor ter wo chumor te jala ke chuan pam re ejmor re chuan pam re me ene jala biya ko ye ibiro ro er tera bali penron
Alabama mananain para KIO kanege paronggan kuruwain. I just recently joined and ever since elegon lang experience at Kane. Eno tao ito tapi pair ngal na Outer Island lo no ba na armi lo Outer Island. Ilair manana ben project nan KIO.
Lo charbali pen KIO talagang kami lo Outer Island. Dilawayan appreciate the charbali nan KIO. Lo chuan nga jaga yo nga ngayo. Ilmu empowering. Kailangan ko rin yung rojan. Yung rojan. Kapangabi lo. Ang pagkatinan, yung rin. Ilaway rin. Ito na ko kapanijuan. Community service. Karay, majuliro lang nala.
I believe women can make positive impact in their respective countries if they work hard for it.
And I believe that all women
regardless of race, age, ethnicity, religion, or status. They're all beautiful, powerful, and resilient women. Also, being from a matrilineal culture, I know that the status of women has always been one of great importance, respect, and influence. I also believe that we are the real architect of our society.
Like women have such an influence in the community. Women are actually the backbone of a lot of what we see today in our island. So women empowerment and women encouragement is such a beautiful thing to do.
I think women are nurturers of our people, our traditional customs, and our culture.
Ejale, I know that Pacific Island women are inspirational, motivated, dedicated, and mothers of our islands.
Edain Monique Graham, Edain Joyoan Romayo. Edain Matuwasi Jackman, Edain Joyoan Romayo. Edain Samantha Hanner, Joya Itbigare.
Edain Kathy Dalamo, Edain Joya Rubit.
Edain Isa Mulap, Edain Joyan Romay.
Etta and Angela, Naisitak Jen Malawelap, Imbar, Canada.
Edain Ella, Edain Joyana Duduyan Namo.
Edain Jasmine, Edain Joanna Vergare.
Edain Angelina Raymond, Edain Joya Romay.
Name is Mitaka, Joy Rumayor.
Edain Philmar Mendoza, yung Joya Agaro. Edain Lori Dudu, Edain Joya Rumayo. Edain Delina Nirlam, Edain Joya Wayan Road. Yung nga idukong labaw tamag idokare.
KIO continues to elevate women's issues
and empower them through our work.
KIO believes in the collective power of women
and in empowering each other to accomplish more together.
We are KIO and we believe in each other.
Thank you very much for that video. So we'll now go to, it's question time. So we'll go and see if we have any questions from our online audience. And also ask our audience here in the room if there are any questions or comments. Sure. We have a question from the room. Okay.
To help them in their health care.
Thank you. That's a very good question, because when we talk about health coverage, universal health for all, we really
The flat rate is $5 fee. You get covered, everything covered from the doctor's fee to the lab, medications. And still that $5 is still a challenge to most of the population. You want the healthcare coverage, yet they have to pay for that $5. Which one will they pay for? Coming to the doctors, or would they rather use that $5 to buy something that's more worth it for their family? And that's why we have to really enforce and work with our communities in order to decrease our cancer rates in the Marshall Islands. And by working with the community and the government, traditional leaders, church leaders, actually provide these health coverage to the rest of the population that are unable to come to the hospital. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
So maybe I'll just summarize briefly for us. I think one of the key messages that has come through in listening to all our speakers is the need for a whole of community, whole of government approach to our health issues. And it's not just the responsibility of our ministries of health, it's our responsibility as members of the community to work with our government around addressing health issues that impact women. One of the key messages that I took was particularly around the nuclear testing and the impact of the nuclear testing on the health and well-being of women in the Marshall Islands, and that these impacts is multi-generational, and that we may not know the actual impact of this in 50 years' time. So I think in that a women's coalition would be quite important, in particularly in ensuring that there's research and that there's continued visibility of these issues. And I think that's quite important, particularly not just for the nuclear testing impacts, but also across all the health issues that our women face. But thank you again to all our panelists here with us and those that have recorded messages and have sent messages through. And thank you to the online audience for participating. And also just a gentle reminder to not to forget to send your votes through that I believe are still open. Vinaka. Oh, I've just been reminded that Dr. Helentina will redo her video message and will post that up online. Vinaka.
Balancing the power in these committees and how you promote gender equality and women's human rights.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to be here today. As you know, we are early in the 116th Congress, and it is the most diverse in our history, including the most ever women elected to Congress, totaling about 1/4 of the entire membership of Congress. Now, back in American Samoa, women can hold chiefly titles, but for us, elected leadership.
There you go. Thank you, NTA.
Thank you, NTA.
Discussions for the conference. Before we move on to our closing statement from our president, Dr. Hilda Heine, I'd like to invite to the podium Ambassador George Fraser of the Australian Embassy to the North Pacific to deliver a few remarks.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here to perform this launch of the second RMI country plan for Pacific women. As was mentioned in one of the videos by Whitney, the Pacific Women Shaping Pacific Development Program was announced or came out of the Pacific Island Forum's meeting in August of 2012, and it announced the amount of money. I think it was about $320 million over 10 years to be spent amongst Forum Island members, and this aims to improve opportunities for political, economic and social development for women in the Pacific. The country plans are the mechanism through which the Pacific Women outcomes and activities are planned and agreed. They provide the detail on what will be funded and how these funding decisions are made. The first plan, the first 3-year plan from 2014 to 16, complemented the existing programs and contributed to gender equality. It funded the establishment of the counselling service of WUTMI, the Weto in Moore, and it also provided capacity support to WUTMI. Now, it's a great pleasure to be here to launch this second plan, which will go through until 2022, and it follows consultations with governments, development partners, NGOs and civil society, but most importantly with women. The new plan will continue to focus on reducing violence against women and supporting the, expanding the supporting networks. It will also look at increasing the economic opportunities for women. I don't want to say too much more from that on this because we're running a little short of time, but I'd very much welcome any questions on the plan. But what I'd like to do first of all is pass a copy of this plan over to the Government of the Marshall Islands. Thank you for mentioning that.
On behalf of the officers and the members of the executive board of WUTMI and all the women benefiting from this program, I would like to extend our deepest appreciation to the Government of Australia and Ambassador. Thank you so much for helping us. Of course, the Government of the Marshall Islands has been behind us all this time, so thank you so much. I would like to include Katie, who was really instrumental in working on this grant proposal. I just came along after her and helped. Thank you very much.
Kumoltada, right now we've come to the closing of our Pacific Women Leaders Coalition Conference, and we'd like to hand it over to Her Excellency President Dr. Hilda C. Heine for her closing remarks.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you for moderating the past few sessions. I had a chance to sit through the last 3 sessions this morning, and I was quite impressed with all the contribution, all the ideas that have come forth. And I want to thank everyone for your contribution and your support. I'm told by the technology folks that we've reached 12,000 people and 4,000 engagement. And we have participants from not just RMI, but Guam, Singapore, US, Fiji, Taiwan, Switzerland, FSM, Australia, Samoa, New Zealand, and the Philippines. So we've reached quite a number of folks, not just in the Marshall Islands, but across the region and beyond. So we're very grateful. I know we're still learning in our efforts to do a virtual conference, and I'm sure that our technology people learn a lot through the process this week. And I can assure you that when we do this again another time, we'll be better at it. Also, I want to say that women in technology is also just learning. I know that some of us weren't pushing our buttons when we were speaking, so it's part of the learning process, but we all grow when we learn something new. So thank you all for all of that. So I want to, of course, recognize the traditional leaders of the Marshall Islands, the Iroj and the Leroj. Of course, Excellency President Tsai Ing-wen, even though she's already left this morning, and the members of our delegation from ROC Taiwan who came to join us yesterday. Of course, the Honorable Faustina Rehur Maruk, and who's the Minister of State of the Republic of Palau, U.S. Congresswoman Aumua Amata Coleman Radowagan of American Samoa. With us also is Ambassador George Fraser of Australia, Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, U.S. Ambassador to the Marshall Islands, Karen Stewart, she's with us this morning, representatives of crop agencies, members of the clergy, business community, distinguished guests, especially our ladies from the Marshall Islands. I want to thank all the women and the students who came this morning. I hope that you learned something and that you will be able to share with your schoolmates and classmates when you go back to your classrooms. Thank you for joining us. So we have come to the closure of the Pacific Women Leaders Coalition Conference. Our conference has generated a lot of interest at a level that we did not expect. Yesterday, at the closing of day one, we landed something like 5,000, and today we have 12,000 people that have we've reached on our website. In preparing for this conference, we opened the opportunities to interested parties, individuals, groups, and stakeholders who were keen on supporting our cause and contributing to the shaping of a Pacific Women Leaders Coalition. The response and unwavering support of our partners and stakeholders has been tremendous, and for that we are grateful for your partnership, your collaboration, and your genuine interest to engage in and be part of this initiative. The discussion in this day and a half, where we have unpacked some of the challenges faced by women in the different areas of gender equality, has reaffirmed the need to scale up efforts to realize commitments made on gender equality. Our conversations have also confirmed that through innovation and creativity and the creation of a mechanism such as the Pacific Women's Coalition would help our cause for gender equality in mobilizing expertise and knowledge and in strategizing on action and sustainable solutions to advance progress and to ensure we are responding to the needs of our women and girls. Ladies and gentlemen, it is also clear from the conference deliberations that while we have made some gains in advancing gender equality in the last 2 decades, several challenges remain. The existence of structural barriers, social norms, as well as stereotypes about gender roles, and the broader challenges around climate change and non-communicable diseases that continue to impact our women disproportionately, require a collaborative effort from committed leaders, advocates, and technical experts to champion our issues at all levels and across all sections of society. Our experience to date and our dialogue in the last 2 days has further indicated that in order for us to make progress, we need to not only renew our commitments to gender equality, but that we need to address our challenges from different perspectives in line with the mandates of our respective organizations or countries at the national, regional, or international to make an impact and to affect change. The root causes of gender inequality are entrenched in our systems as societies, and challenging these systems require collective approach that is informed by evidence and knowledge and robust evaluation and learning to ensure we have headed in the right direction, or we're heading in the right direction. I am pleased to know that we all see value in strengthening women's agency and in mobilizing our collective as women leaders, as feminists, and as advocates for gender equality. From a leader's perspective, we need to be convinced about what we do, and our pursuit for gender equality requires that we lead with the conviction that promoting gender equality as a prerequisite to sustainable development is the right thing to do, and that it is also our moral obligation to society, to those who have paved the way for us, so our Blue Pacific identity is sustained for current and future generations. Over the course of next 6 months, we will be accepting nominations from interested parties, stakeholders, and individuals who are keen to be part of the Pacific Women Leaders Coalition. As we embark on this new chapter of our journey to achieving gender equality in our region, we trust that our conviction on promoting gender equality will translate to the operationalization of the Pacific Women Leaders Coalition over the next 1 to 2 years. As with any new initiative or change, these are always driven by ambition and aspirations to succeed. At the same time, there are always associated risks and challenges, and we know from our own experiences in driving multiple new initiatives that risk management is a must, and the same principles apply in this context as we move forward with the establishment of the Pacific Women Leaders Coalition. In closing, I want to again acknowledge Her Excellency President Tsai and her delegation from Republic of China, Taiwan, for the financial support which has made this conference a reality. I also want to thank all of our partners, including the crop agencies and other stakeholders who have contributed in many ways to the success of this conference. Our government could not have pulled this off without your support, and we are grateful for your ongoing partnership and collaboration. For those of you who have traveled far to be here, we pray for for the Lord's traveling mercies, and we hope to see you all again very soon. In saying farewell, I want to leave with you some short Marshallese wisdom. Or in English, there is strength in number. Another way of saying the same thing is, no woman is an island entire of itself. Every woman is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. We need to work together. So special komoltada to all the watch parties from the different communities and to all of you in this hall this morning. Again, komoltada and safe travel to those of you who travel far here. Thank you again. We couldn't get the cruise because of the weather. So for those of you who are here, we have a luncheon at the MIR. Please join us for lunch. I think we were scheduled to start around 2, so that gives us some time to get together and get going over there. So those of you who can join us, please welcome to come and get some food. It's been a long morning, so thank you again. Kumoltada.